Good morning, everyone. I think the cold has constrained our vocal cords. Good morning, everyone. All right. I think we have folks online as well. Can I get a comms check online? Okay, great. Well, I'm pleased to get started today. Thank you, everyone, for coming to the Darpa Subterranean Challenge Proposers Day. My name is Tim Chung. I'm in the Tactical Technology Office as a program manager, and I'm deeply excited to welcome all of you here today, as well as those who are represented online. Just to give you approximate stats, we'll have close to 200 folks here today. We'll have about 50 presenters in the back. We have about 300 folks from all over the world online, and I think the breadth of the interest that we're talking about today is where we're getting a lot of this excitement. So I'll just kind of lay some of the ground rules of the day in terms of agenda and so forth, turn it over to some administrative aspects, and then get started. Okay, thank you. So here's what we're interested in for today's Proposers Day. Ultimately, I really just want to introduce you to what we're envisioning for the Darpa Subterranean Challenge, and essentially how ambitious we're striving to be, being that we're DARPA. I want to encourage and facilitate the interactions, not only amongst the folks that are in this room, the folks that are on the webcast, but the broader community, because I think there's a lot of innovation and knowledge to be shared and learned from. And then ultimately, I'm encouraging of you to think about and how to strategically position yourselves in terms of teaming with those that might complement your strengths or otherwise bolster your weaknesses. Okay. The agenda for today is pretty rapid fire. This morning we'll spend a little bit of time describing the program from our side on the DARPA end, but ultimately the later morning and the afternoon is reserved for facilitating those interactions that I just spoke about. I strongly encourage you to go and meet and interact with folks, either those that are in your wheelhouse or those that are not. You'll identify a number of both academic, industry, commercial, and government folks here in the room today, and I think we can all learn from one another in terms of where technology stands and where it could go under the Darpa Subterranean Challenge. So as I highlighted, I'm really interested in these lightning talks and the interactive poster sessions that we'll be hosting today. The main purpose of this is, again, to get that mixture happening, get a lot of contact minutes in this case. And so the ROEs, the rules of engagement for these lightning talks, is for those of you who are already seated in these speaker seats for that first session, thank you. And for those of you who will be speaking in that first session, please relocate here during the break so that we can rapid fire you through your 2-minute slots. So we have seats reserved here by speaker number for the first session, and then after lunch you'll be able to take your seats according to your second session's number. I have reserved only 2 minutes. You will get buzzed. You'll get this embarrassing red light over here going off. We're really interested in getting to the bottom lines up front, and you'll have that chance to expound upon your either technology or your experience through the interactive poster sessions. So really want to have you maximize your time here on stage, and we'll be cycling you throughout. As soon as your slide vanishes from the screen, that means it's time to get off the stage, and I hope you'll be able to respect that. The poster sessions, many of you, I see the posters already set up in the back. You have your numbers. Please engage. I know you'll be interested in reaching out and meeting with others as well, so if you depart your post, that's totally fine, but I do encourage you to be around so that you can really see we've have quite a diverse set of posters out there, and I think it'll inspire a lot of really good conversation. Okay. The next thing I want to highlight is our Q&A platform. So for those of you who have done work with DARPA, by the way, just a quick show of hands, how many of you have done work with DARPA before? Okay. Out of curiosity, how many of you not done work with DARPA? All right, great. So by my count, about 65% of those who are on site are prior DARPA familiar with DARPA. About 35% of the folks on the webcast are familiar with DARPA. So I think we're seeing new areas coming to engage on this particular topic with DARPA, which is exactly what we're interested in, to get those innovative and fresh ideas. Along those lines, we're interested in your questions, and so we've highlighted if you can go to darpasubtchallenge.socialqa.com. It provides you with a way to go ahead and digitally ask your questions. Just for your awareness, we also have Wi-Fi available here. The Wi-Fi information is posted on the columns for those of you who would like to access the available Wi-Fi on site. But as far as your questions are concerned, go ahead and post them, and you'll see them be reflected both on your digital device as well as what we have on screen here. We are moderating those questions, so I have my crack team of folks assessing the questions. It all get posted. You'll go able to, hey, I have that question as well. Let me go plus that one up. And we have reserved some Q&A time this afternoon so that we can go ahead and address a subset of those questions. The idea here is anything that's not particularly clear or something that you have a burning question or you really want to get something out there to kind of plant the seed of what your colleagues or competitors might be interested in, please feel free to use this medium. The first question here, I'll just go ahead and say, Q&A is, will they be mailed available after Proposals Day? The short answer is yes, in the form of the FAQs. But to the extent, go ahead and populate these questions, and I think it'll offer us both real-time feedback for me and my team, but also communally offer up an opportunity to see where some of those questions are as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to some of our administrative activities, to our security personnel and our contracts management office. First, I'll turn it over to Sonia.
Good morning, I'm Sonia, security for Subterranean, and I'll go over just a couple of things today since, of course, we're in an unclassified setting, so this will be pretty easy. Once again, I'll set the level at the unclassified level for the duration of the day. Because we are in an open forum, open setting, there's no restrictions on electronics whatsoever. In fact, you're encouraged to use them, and also including in the Q&A that you'll post during the day. There are no access badges for the building or for the room, as I'm sure you've noticed, but we do ask that you display your name badge, your Darpa name badge for the day, so that we do know that you are registered and should be here. I did have a blurb at the bottom to conceal your badge when you go out for lunch, but you do not have to do that. You can show that thing off anywhere you go. Since we're in this open setting, it's not necessary to conceal any name badges. And the last thing is, in case we have an emergency, we will help you egress if we need to evacuate. Outside of this room, across the hall near the restrooms, is the stairwell. And we will take the stairwell to get out of the building as quickly as possible. Once you're out of the building, you'll go to the left. Following these green arrows, just continue to the left to this little circular area. That will be our first assembly point. If first responders think we need to move further away, they will take us a little further down this street for that congregation that's shown on the map. And that is basically it for the unclass setting. If you have any questions or need help with anything, please ask me or anyone that has DARPA on the bottom of the organization on their name badge. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia.
You're welcome.
If I could ask our contracting officer to come on up, and we'll talk about how to work with DARPA.
Thanks, Tim. Good morning, everybody. My name is Chris Lista. I am a DARPA contracting officer, as Tim mentioned, and I am here to discuss the broad agency announcement process. So I know most of you didn't come here to hear a contracting officer talk, so I'll try to be brief. Two things I want to discuss. What is a BAA first, which we'll cover on the first slide, and then how the process works. Essentially, a broad agency announcement is the way the Department of Defense procures research and development used for basic and applied research. And the key definition to take away here is that it's to be used when meaningful proposals with varying approaches can be reasonably anticipated. So there are different types of solicitations throughout the government. You have invitations for bids, RFPs, requests for quotes. BAAs are really used when we don't have a specification. We're expecting lots of different ideas. Hopefully we get those. If we don't, we didn't do our job correctly. So that's why we're using a BAA. It's described in the FAR Part 35, and I normally wouldn't mention the Federal Acquisition Regulation, but in this case, believe it or not, the BAA is described in 6 paragraphs. That compares to 11 pages for a traditional RFP, so it really is a streamlined process. We like it. Us being a government agency, however, we had to supplement the 6 paragraphs with about 50 pages of DARPA-specific regulations. It's really not that bad, but In the interest of full transparency, you can actually download that from our website, so you can see exactly how your proposal will be evaluated and all the other good statutory stuff. I'm going to kind of summarize in a few words here what it says in that instruction. Once you submit your proposal, what happens to it? Does it go into a black hole? Does one person look at it and say, this is garbage, throw it away? No. I think the key thing to point out here before I get into this is there's no common statement of work, right? We're talking about R&D, different approaches. We really don't have an apples-to-apples type comparison situation. There's the actual definition. But because of that, there's no real ranking like you would see. We don't get a proposal and say you're first, you're second, you're third. What we do is once we get proposals, they go to a scientific review panel. And those proposals are deemed by the panel to be either selectable or non-selectable. Selectable essentially means if we had an unlimited budget, would this thing be worth doing? Non-selectable means, it's just not worth our time. We couldn't award it in good conscience for the taxpayers. Among the selectable proposals, typically we have more that are selectable than the funding available. So what will happen is Tim, in consultation with his team, will basically recommend a subset of the selectable proposals for funding. And then ultimately, the final say is the TTO Office Director, Fred Kennedy, who he gets to make the final say. However, if he overrides Tim, he has to document that. So I bring this up because I want to point out there's lots of checks and balances. It's not one guy basically making the final decision. Okay, these are the evaluation criteria. I don't know how many of you have read the draft BAA, but that's what you'll see in there. And these criteria here, they basically comply with the little blurb from the FAR that says, essentially technical is the most important. We're an R&D agency. If you don't have a good idea, you're not going to get funded. But we do also have to look at these other 4 attributes there. Okay, so a brief word on communications. Today we want to talk as much as possible, communicate as much as possible. That's why we're here. After today, it kind of becomes more of a one-way street. Things sort of shut down. If you have questions, you'll have to submit those to the BAA mailbox. At which point we'll consolidate the questions and we'll be posting the answers on FedBizOps that you can take a look at. Also, should you be selected, just want to remind you that only a contracting officer can obligate the government. So if somebody else calls you and says, hey, this is great, glad you got selected, let's start working, please don't do that. Do that at your own peril. And then the last bullet, informal feedback. Regardless of whether or not you're selected or not selected, you do have a right to receive feedback as to what we liked and didn't like about your proposal, the strengths and weaknesses. So please avail yourself of that opportunity. We like to provide the feedback to improve the proposals we get in the future. Eligibility information. Pretty much this thing is open to everybody. We're not setting aside anything for small business. I mean, we do encourage small businesses to participate, but we're really looking for the best ideas. If you are a member of a government agency or a federally funded research and development center, there are some limitations. You should know these, or someone at your organization should, but essentially you have to prove that you're not directly competing with industry. You have a unique idea that we can't get from industry, and you have to have the statutory authority to propose to government solicitations. You have to include that with your proposal. Some things to be aware of. The top one, there's a general prohibition against providing advisory and assistance services to Darpa and being a Darpa R&D performer. Now, most of you here probably aren't providing CETA support to Darpa, but one thing to be aware of, you may team with somebody and they may be doing that, in which case that's a problem. So as you're putting together your team, if you're going to team, make sure that they don't have any CETA type support they're offering to Darpa, your subcontractors. Before you receive an award, you'll have to register at the System for Award Management, complete some online reps and certs, which can take a little bit of time. I don't think it's too bad, but there's a lot of legal language there, so don't wait for the last second for that. If you're a large business and you're proposing a FAR-based contract, you'll have to provide a small business contracting plan. And for any effort that's a FAR-based contract over $750,000, you're going to have to provide a certified cost and pricing data certificate. If you don't know what that is, you can figure it out during negotiations. Not a big deal. Just a heads up. Okay, award instruments. What type? We're not limiting ourselves to just contracts here. Contracts are fine. We don't discourage them, but we're also allowing for other transactions and cooperative agreements, which are more geared towards nonprofits and universities. I will point out that the draft BAA mentioned grants. I think we're going to pull that out of there because we do want to have interaction with the performers. We're not just going to be giving you a check and say, see you later. We do want to talk with you. If you do propose a FAR contract and you want a cost reimbursable type contract, you have to have an approved accounting system. We can work with you. If you don't, we'd probably recommend a fixed price contract with some performance-based payments, minimum payments. You can try to get your accounting system approved if it's not, but just as a heads up, it can take a while. So if you don't have that, you're probably going to be looking at a fixed price type instrument. And the other transaction for prototype agreement, you may have heard of these. We're pretty big on them here at Darpa. That's the definition. To get an OT, it has to be directly relevant to enhancing the mission effectiveness of, I'll just skip through, of the Department of Defense. We've determined that this program does do that, so other transactions are a possibility. And you may find this, this method of contracting attractive for the reason that there's certain federal laws that don't apply. Truthful cost and pricing, that certificate I was mentioning earlier, you won't have to certify your costs. You don't have to abide by cost accounting standards. Government property, you don't have to have an extensive government property tracking system in place. I'm sure there's some other things I'm forgetting, but essentially it gives non-traditional performers a little bit more flexibility. However, beware, there are certain conditions you have to meet to receive another transaction. You have to have one non-traditional contractor participating to a significant extent. Significant is not defined, but it shouldn't be just a sheet metal vendor. They have to be doing some key part of the research. All the participants in the OT project are small businesses or non-traditional defense contractors. And lastly, if you're a large contractor, you can still receive an OT, but if you don't have any non-traditional participants, you're going to have to pony up 1/3 of the cost of the project. And just to drill down on that a little bit more, what's a small business? Essentially, for this solicitation, if you have less than 1,000 employees, you are small. So I think that's most organizations. And I guess another thing, the non-traditional contractor, the definition is a little bit different. That one's even broader. If you haven't worked on a contract during the past year that's greater than $50 million, you're actually considered a non-traditional DoD contract. So they expanded that last year to greatly enlarge the pool of people that can receive other transactions. So if you have questions about your eligibility, please let us know. We don't want you to go down one path and then find out you're not eligible. And again, if you want to read more than you ever wanted to know about OTs, the latest other transaction guide is publicly available at that website. I believe we will be making these charts available online if you want to circle back with that. Okay, one thing I want to point out, this is kind of near and dear to my heart, because we're getting proposals with different approaches and we don't have that apples to apples comparison, this really isn't a price competition. You're going to have to justify the price that you propose. I'm going to have to analyze that as a contracting officer and make a determination as to whether or not that's fair and reasonable. So please follow the directions in the BAA in terms of cost. We ask for very specific things, not only of you, but also your subcontractors. And just one thing I'll also point out, I think in the draft BAA, we did put some not to exceed budgets, and that is, it is a not to exceed amount. You can propose up to that amount, but don't just do that as a means of being lazy. We do evaluate you on, is the cost you proposed reasonable for what you're doing? A lot of times we'll say, hey, we just proposed the not to exceed amount and we couldn't really justify why. So that's just, recently that's something I've encountered. Really think, is what I'm proposing in terms of cost absolutely necessary to accomplish the research? Subcontracting, if you are teaming, and you're not required to team, I just want to make that, we don't care about the composition of your team per se, but if you do team and one of your teammates is providing, an essential piece of the research, we're going to require you to actually have them as a team member when we put you on contract. So you can't propose somebody and say, oh, we were just kidding. There's no bait and switch type arrangement that we're going to entertain there. Additional things that you'll find in the award instruments, there'll be a key personnel clause. You'll be asked to identify those individuals in your proposal. We expect them to participate. If they are unable to participate because they left, took another job somewhere, you're going to have to demonstrate that their replacement is equally qualified. And I also wanted to mention, I know that there's a lot of interest in this, maybe from some universities, that this is classified as fundamental research. So at this point, we do not anticipate having any pre-publication approval requirements. You'll be free to publish the results of your research. Intellectual property, finally. Data rights. You're going to be required in your proposal to assert any restrictions you may have on data to be developed, data you're either bringing to the project or that you're going to develop. These apply not only to you, but also to your subcontractors. And we're going to use this information during evaluations to determine whether or not your proposal is attractive. I believe the third evaluation criteria was potential relevance and contribution to the DARPA mission. All things being equal, the more we can do with the data that's involved in the project, the more attractive it is. So that's something to keep into mind. It's not to say that you can't take something you've developed with your own money and assert restrictions. You just have to think about how that might impact the output of the effort as a whole. And for those that aren't familiar, really quickly, there's essentially three categories of data rights. You have your unlimited rights, which is where the government's paid for the research, so we can essentially do whatever we want with it. We can give it to other performers for government purposes. We can give it to somebody to commercialize. It is what it says, it's unlimited. Government purpose rights, that's typically the case when we funded something in part, and that allows the government to give the data to other entities, but only to do something for the government, so we would not be allowed to commercialize that data that we paid for in part. And then limited restricted rights, that's when you develop something completely at private expense that you're bringing to the project, and essentially we can't do anything with that except consume it internally. So basically it gets down to funding source, that the rights you're going to assert are based on who paid for the development of the data. The other category of IP is inventions. If you're going to be using a patented invention in your effort, basically you're going to be required to provide documentation that you do have the rights to use that. You don't want to get sued for infringement down the road. And also, if you invent something during the course of the research, the government gets certain rights to that invention, and you're required to disclose it to us. DARPA here uses the iEdison tool. It's an online reporting system. And before I go, one thing I didn't mention, I do believe we're allowing for abstracts with this BAA. So you do not have to submit an abstract prior to submitting a proposal. You can propose straight away. However, proposals are expensive, and if you want to get some initial DARPA feedback, submitting an abstract is probably not a bad idea. But just also to be clear, just because you don't receive a favorable response to your abstract, you're still not precluded from submitting a proposal. So we could change our minds later. Your proposal's more detailed than your abstract. You're free to propose no matter our response to the abstract you submit. So those are my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. So I'm real-time monitoring the questions. I'm going to go ahead and just on the fly answer one quick one. Lightning presentation posters, as well as the charts that we're talking about right now, they will indeed be posted online, so you'll have access to all of these slides. And so I encourage you to take a look, especially those links about that delightful reading about other transactions that Chris alluded to. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our office director. The Tactile Technology Office Director is Dr. Fred Kennedy. He'll set the stage for what are the kind of things that we're interested in TTO, and how the Sub-T Challenge kind of fits into that broader picture. Fred. Thanks. So does this work? All right, so welcome to the Sub-T Challenge. This is exciting stuff. We don't do a lot of challenges. If you're a DARPA devotee, you may be familiar with some of the things we've done in the past, the Grand Challenge, the Urban Challenges for autonomous vehicles, the Cyber Grand Challenge, robotics challenges. So we don't do a lot, but when we do, we're excited about the output. And we really do this because we don't know what the outcome should be. We may understand the problem we're trying to solve, which is typical DARPA first question to ask: what problem are you trying to solve? But what we don't really understand is the true extent, the breadth of the solution space.
And so when we get into that mode, we may not want to run a program because we're not as certain. Challenge is perfect because we really want to see the innovation. We want to see non-traditional capabilities come out of this and tell us, hey, you hadn't thought about this before. You hadn't thought about this this domain or this suite of capabilities. Perhaps you could use a system like what we're building or a concept or architecture like what we proposed. So that's what the challenges are good for. And I have to tell you, I'm going to step away from this. Can you all hear me in the back? Okay. I don't know if there's mics up here picking this up. I just hate to be tied to a podium. Will it work, or can I pick something up and walk around? You good? All right. So the first thing I'm going to do, can you go to the next slide? I have to do that myself at that time. I can walk around with this. Yes. Okay. First thing I'm going to do is give you just a little bit of context. Can you barely hear me back there? Okay, all right. I'll walk out here. I'm going to give you a little bit of context for the office, what the office does, and what I'm trying to do with it. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about why this challenge fits and why it's so important. So we're going to get to that right now. In terms of the overarching theme for the technology office, it's about enterprise-level disruption, which in a nutshell means we have a bunch of unquestioned assumptions inside the DoD about how to get things done. And I'd like to question those assumptions. And I'd like to draw in programs and providers and vendors who can tell me how to work different, orthogonal solutions, how we might get things done in the future. The reason I care about that is because our adversaries are outthinking us. And that's a real problem. And that's not just a slogan, it's absolutely the case. I can go domain by domain and show you where our potential adversaries are getting to solutions quicker, understanding what we do today, and figuring out how to counter. We need to get better at getting inside their loops, their decision loops. Right now, they're inside ours. I would say we've got a little bit complacent over the past 50 or 60 years. We have a structure, a bureaucracy in place that doesn't respond well to emerging threats, and this is a serious problem for us. Darpa was really stood up to stop this kind of problem. It stood up in 1958 to respond to Sputnik. We have a number of Sputnik moments that are occurring, not all of which we can talk about in unclassified form, but they are out there, and they are of deep concern. So what we are about, and what my office specifically is about, is how to get back inside the adversary's decision. I think I kind of just said this. We're really good at making very expensive platforms that really do amazing things. However, they're expensive. They take a long time to build, and we don't have a good system in place to allow for how to do the next thing, how to create the next best enhancement. They take decades. We tend to spend a lot of effort on monolithic solutions, high-value asset solutions, things that are really big, really expensive, and we're very good at it. But again, it takes decades to build. It takes billions of dollars to put capabilities in place. And once you've done that, it's very hard to move. It's very hard to move away from those kinds of systems and platforms. You see here, this limits the way we fight in the future because we end up with sunk cost in systems we have today. And it leaves us open to adversaries and their asymmetric problems. So that's where we are. What we'd like to do inside the office and within Darpa more broadly is figure out how to exploit seams in the current domains. And this actually is a great example of a seam. The subterranean environment, I will say, is a wonderful seam that we have not exploited properly in the land domain. We just have not. I'll give a little bit of a vignette on this in a few minutes. As I mentioned before, I'm very concerned about very expensive things. And so in some other domains, especially the maritime and space domains, I'm intrigued by getting away from high-value assets and figuring out how to do a lot more disaggregated. And then finally, as I mentioned before, we need to figure out how to get back inside the adversary's decision. How do we get the time asymmetry back that at one point we did in fact have? We don't have it today. So, there are a number of different seams that we've been looking at in terms of opportunities to go address with the one I want to talk about here is the subterranean scene. Our adversaries have learned how to use capabilities underground against us. Now, I was overseas back in February of last year, and I was chatting with some folks who have significant experience with folks working in the underground environment. Their adversaries are working in the underground environment. And the comment was made to me that when these constructions, when these tunnels and caves are found, when they're found, and they're not found very often, when they are found, they're often destroyed. And that intrigued me at the time, because I said, well, why would you just destroy them? Well, it's too dangerous to leave them open for our adversaries to play with. Well, why wouldn't you want to be down in those buried tunnels yourself? Why don't you try to exploit the capabilities that your adversaries have created for you? Take them back, use them against them. Why wouldn't you look at that as an opportunity as opposed to just a threat? And the answer was, well, we really hadn't thought about that. We're not sure we like that idea. Okay, then I'm pretty sure it's something that Darpa should go tackle because it's uncomfortable. It's something we haven't tried before. And frankly, I think this is the place where we have to go in the future. We have some very significant threats in the subterranean environment. People have figured out how to get down under us to do business. And if the only answer we have is, well, I just want to find the darn things and blow them up, I don't think that's a good enough answer. I think we need to figure out how to exploit these networks. And the reason I think we need to do that is because rather than put our people at risk, rather than put soldiers at risk trying to get inside these installations, I would like to find a better way to do this in advance of putting our troops in harm's way. I want to put capability out in front. I want to learn what's there. And only then do I want to allow to have soldiers go in and do whatever work they have to do. That's principally where I'm coming from. That's what's of interest to me. Now we'll hear about vignettes in terms of first responder capabilities, but I will tell you from a DoD standpoint, what I want to make sure of is that these networks, whether they're caves, urban infrastructure, tunnels, whatever they might be, I want to make sure they not only do not pose a threat to us, but that we can actually exploit those networks for our own uses. All right. So I think I just said. So my bottom line is no more hiding. You can't hide from the U.S. That's what I'm here to say. So does anyone have any questions about sort of the context and where we're hoping to go with the sub-T challenge? I'd be happy to just answer quick. I think I have a couple of minutes. I actually have more than that. Any comments or questions at all? All right, well, we're going to stay at it. Oh, I got one. All right.
How does this effort differ from other efforts that are ongoing in the subterranean area? Well, what efforts have you numerous efforts on subterranean?
Veterans efforts on subterranean. You want to speak to that?
Sure. Yeah, so the question is, there are other ongoing activities that are exploring, whether that be in academic, industry, and DoD type contexts, and in fact across other government agencies as well. So of course there are some existing state-of-the-art, state-of-practice. What we're interested in DARPA is exceeding them wildly, given understanding where the technology is going and how to advance well beyond the current state-of-the-art. So to address those specific points that you're talking about, use them as watermarks, and then dial to 11, right? And that's what we're interested in for the sub-T challenge.
That said, we are working with all of our colleagues in all of these organizations. So what Tim said is absolutely true. You've got an idea that's working inside other agencies. By all means, we'd like to talk about it. If it can be actionable, specific to yes, we're going to pose it as part of the challenge, great. But we really want to start thinking out of the box in a serious way. I don't think we have the answer at all. We don't know what to go build. And because of that, that's why we're coming to all of you and say, look, I want to exploit these facilities underground. If I want to go into these tunnels, I need to map them. I need to map them very quickly. What do? I
of the Army's connections associated with those types of training sites. I'll leave it at that. So the question was, can we make the LNO, that's a liaison officer to a number of these different facilities? The intent here is to broaden that ecosystem in the community, so to the extent that we're able to make those connections so that you can leverage those types of experiences and expertise, yeah, I think that's certainly well within the realm of our interest for sub-T.
Any other questions or comments? Well, I welcome you all to the sub-T Challenge. I think it's going to be exciting, and just on behalf of the agency director, Dr. Walker, look forward to seeing where we go with this. Over to Tim. Good luck.
All right. Thank you very much, Fred. No problem. Appreciate that. All right. So now that kind of sets a context, what we want to do right now is get into the weeds a little bit more about the specific vision for the sub-T challenge, provide you a little bit of the who, what, why, when, where, how kind of context, and get into the details. I do want to highlight that there is a draft broad agency announcement online for those of you who may not have yet seen that. That's posted on fedbizops.gov under the special notice announcing this Proposers Day. The idea there is for you to be able to take a look, see what we're interested in. I encourage you to, if you haven't done that already, go ahead and do that. And given the draft nature of it, I welcome the type of interactions or feedback ahead of its official release. Okay. All right, so I'm really excited about the sub-T challenge. And let me first off and go highlight that the sub-T challenge, the subterranean challenge, it's speaking very broadly. We're not looking necessarily to narrow the focus because, as Dr. Kennedy said, we don't necessarily know what the quote-unquote right solution is to this particular problem. What is that problem that we're trying to solve? We're interested in understanding how to acquire rapid, timely, persistent situational awareness in these really complex environments. And you might say there are many complex environments out there, and you're absolutely right. The complex environment that we're interested in spans a number of different subdomains, and I articulate those here, namely things like human-made tunnel structures, whether that be border tunnels or natural or mines, like coal mines or metal mines, whether you're dealing with urban underground, urban municipal infrastructure, storm drains, metro transit stations and tunnels, etc. And you might also envision how some of the challenges of those human-made systems relate to cave networks, naturally occurring cave networks. And what we're interested in is understanding how to acquire the situational awareness necessary, for example, for follow-on operations of interest to DoD in this case. So let me go and present what we envision for the Darpa Subterranean Challenge. We're interested in not just tackling one of those little vignettes, one of those little subdomains. We're interested in understanding how we develop systems that can broadly address across those subdomains. So not only are we interested in one kind of point solution, we're interested in a versatile solution that will allow us to go and span that. And what one better way to do that is to have a challenge that compels us, that inspires us to go and explore all of those in some sort of integrated fashion. And I'll describe all of those things in greater detail throughout this presentation. But those three subdomains that I've highlighted are of deep interest to both DoD as well as to civilian and other government organizations. We'll have two competition tracks, namely a systems track, where we get to go potentially bend metal or collect real data or what have you, and a virtual systems track, a virtual track that allows us to go really expand the scope, the bounds of what we're interested in into more relevant or even beyond current scales of interest. Okay. And then ultimately we're interested in, as Dr. Kennedy said, revolutionizing, rethinking how we operate in that underground domain. All right, so with that, let me just highlight, I've talked a little bit about the why, we've discussed that, talked a bit about the what. I'm going to delve into the details, given that this is Proposers Day, interested in proposing to the BAA on how we actually execute that going forward. So in that draft BAA, you'll see an illustrative scenario of interest, of particular kind of noting it here. There are a couple of concepts of operations that one might imagine needing to conduct in underground environments. And whether that's kind of on the left side, dealing with lead times that might be weeks or months at a time, that might be anything from infrastructure inspection, quality control, etc. Those can take some time. Maybe that's a lot more deliberate, maybe more methodical. Maybe that's where some of the technologies today are already operating. The risk is low. I mean risk in terms of risk to personnel, typically lower. And we're interested in things like exploration, discovery, inspection. You might have another vignette or concept of operation that's more in that window. If you just have a handful of hours to go and capture that situational awareness, it's urgent, so we need to, time is of the essence. There is a fair bit of risk because of the unknown and the uncertainty. And in these cases, such as, for example, cave or urban search and rescue or underground search and rescue, we really need to respond, but we need to also get a lay of the land so that we can afford and manage the risk to our first responders or warfighters. You have this other scenario where you're right at the bleeding edge of operations. T-minus minutes is what we can imagine. This is real time. We've made the decision, or someone's made the decision that we need to send personnel in, and that operating environment does provide, but it's high risk potentially, but it's accepted or acceptable risk. And in these cases, we're really interested in that intervention. And so highlighting the scenario of interest, specifically of interest to the Darpa Subterranean Challenge, we're really focusing in that case where we need to build that picture rapidly. It's unknown and uncertain, so we don't know what we don't know, and we need to send in a capability or use a capability that will provide us with that situational awareness. The environments can degrade or change over time, so that time constant of less than a few hours is critical here for being able to provide the best and updated information to the folks that we're presumably sending in shortly thereafter. Okay, so hopefully that sets a stage. That's also in that draft BAA. But again, this is where on that spectrum of concepts of operations we're operating. So let me give you a sense. This is one aspect that you might imagine how the Subterranean Challenge unfolds. I mentioned there are two tracks, a systems and a virtual track, 3 subdomains. Here's one way that the final event, which I'll speak to, might ultimately play out. We'll initialize our challenge course, and I've highlighted just candidate teams or candidate potential solutions here. You'll see team 1 maybe using autonomous systems, but note that this is not the Subterranean Robotics Challenge. This is the Subterranean Challenge. We're interested in solutions that span not just the unmanned, but other things as well. For example, advances in signal processing and other methods of leveraging signals of opportunity, leveraging computation that now affords us to do better approximations of that environment. Those are all relevant to this competition as well. And you might even imagine incorporating biological systems or other types of solutions that are a little bit beyond what might be traditionally thought of. And so whether you're putting sensor payloads on dragonfly backpacks or having creepy crawlers kind of walk around and map the space or what have you, that's all, again, things that we would love to see in the proposals and the types of proposed solutions so that we broaden the space, widen the aperture, and really capture the innovation that we know is out there. Okay. You can imagine us structuring, and again, a little bit of difficulty to see some of the lighting here, but to the extent that we're building out what we envision to be this final challenge course that encompasses those 3 subdomains. You may be good at one sport, but if you can't cross-train into the other sports, then that might be a limitation for your capabilities in this type of an environment. We're interested in how you're versatile across those domains. Those subdomains include, again, as I mentioned, the human-made tunnel systems, the urban undergrounds, the naturally occurring cave networks, and there are many distinct challenges as well as complementary and common challenges amongst those subdomains, and those are we're interested in understanding the capabilities and limitations of both the state-of-the-art and then pushing well beyond that. Suppose you bring a solution to the table. They may include those multi-robot teams, as we've highlighted, bio-machine symbiosis, advanced signal processing, whatever the case may be. We're interested to hear what you have to offer. I'll highlight that, hey, some of these kind of the spatial constraints, I want to be able to, in some ways, bound the space. So there will be places, as an example, where you have to fit through human crawlable space, kind of commando crawl spaces, and that bounds, for example, you can go smaller or bigger if you wish, but that's one fixed point in terms of where you might have to address. And there are a number of those types of challenge elements that we'll describe here shortly. You might deploy your solution, for example, as they filter through these spaces. We're interested in rapidly, accurately mapping, facilitating navigation, and being able to search this space for objects of interest. You have that collaborative potential, collective mapping capability, you're interested in an aggregate capability that you bring to the table. We'll have that fixed time window so that urgency is met in this particular context. And again, we're interested in that search mission where you're either identifying a potential gas leak after a coal mine explosion, whether you're trying to find a trapped survivor, or the lost spelunker if you're trying to identify contraband or other items that are of interest to these particular mission sets. These are the types of things that we might consider in this sub-T challenge. And then ultimately, we're interested in, of course, highlighting across those metrics, what capabilities seem to work well. And the thing to take away here is that there are solutions that might work well for one subdomain that don't translate to the other. So why is that relevant? Well, from our stakeholders, we've heard for sure and have experiences working in with these point solutions that might work in one environment. You go 10 kilometers away and the geology is different, that solution no longer works. And that's something that we can't necessarily have point solutions for everything, and we're interested in finding that versatility that comes from the innovations that we're seeking in the sub-T challenge. So I hinted at some of those elements. What are some of the features of these challenge courses that are going to stress test, that are going to allow us to push the boundaries of where technology is today and what we need it to do in the future? So here are a handful of those challenge elements, in particular the navigation solutions that we have under there. And now we're not talking about just hundreds of feet or meters. How do you do this type of sustained long endurance navigation under these austere conditions? Some of these environments are sparsely featured. That renders many of our solutions to be more challenged. How do we address that? Degraded sensing. There's an understood problem, but there may be innovative solutions to get around that. That includes everything from low light to even no light, obscure due to dust and other particulates, smoke, other types of things might certainly be under there. And for the types of environments we might consider radiated energy in terms of RF or whatnot might also suffer from scattering or other things. So there are many challenges out there from a sensing point of view. We're interested in understanding what you can bring to the table to holistically provide that map, navigation, and search capability. Comms, we know, whether that's individual radios, frequencies, waveforms, etc. There are many physical impediments or physical limitations to having that reliable link. And understanding what we mean by and requiring those kind of links, we want to challenge the assumption that you need to have perfect connectivity throughout at all times. What does it mean to have communications in an underground environment? Hey, the terrain might change as well. I'm not quite convinced we're going to have Indiana Jones-style boulders running down the tunnels, but to the extent that we may have falling debris or changing structures that might happen or things have moved, or maybe your own system is now an impediment having failed is now its own obstacle that you now need to circumnavigate. And the map that you might have had before no longer might apply in those cases. How do we deal with the dynamic environments that might arise in these really complex environments? Endurance limits, as many of you may be familiar, we can handle maybe some distances, maybe different solutions afford different mission durations, but how do we span spatially and temporally the scales that we're interested in, the scales that we'll be pushing the boundaries on for the challenge? And then ultimately, these terrain obstacles, these are things that really challenge how one might maneuver through these spaces, whether it's confined narrow passageways, whether it's a HVAC vent that you now need to crawl through, maybe it's obstacles that you can't go up and around, you need to go under in some capacity. Maybe you need to take the long way around and just know that there is a long way around. So these types of understanding of obstacles is a key feature of the challenge courses we're envisioning as well. So you can imagine all of those filtering into where we can make an impact, and this is where we're looking for solutions. In fact, we're looking for holistic solutions that can address complementary in an integrated fashion across these four domains and these four tech areas. In particular, the autonomy, perception, networking, mobility. These are all things that one might need to bring to the table. We envision that these are all relevant aspects that are touched upon by these challenge elements that we're interested in understanding where that happens. So to just give you a context of this mapping, you can imagine that there's significant overlap, that one solution that addresses austere navigation may not be well positioned to address how we handle endurance, as an example. And so that trade space, not knowing what the right answer is right now, that's what we're interested in. That's what we're soliciting for in the subterranean challenge. So let me throw this out here a little bit in the context of the challenge focus as we've highlighted. We're interested in that disruption. We're interested in understanding what the questions are and why, what the assumptions are and how best to question them. And in particular, we're interested in dramatically accelerating. So in other words, not incrementally or in an evolutionary manner, but we're dramatically accelerating the breakthroughs that allow us to operate in these types of unstructured, complex environments. So I've highlighted according to the technology area, we have a number of measures for how we might assess some of the performance, and here are some of those stretch goals. And the key takeaway here is some of these stretch goals you might be able to take care of individually, in isolation for maybe set scenarios, or in operations that are narrowly focused, but being able to broadly understand the trade space and broadly and in a versatile manner, being able to handle the broad subdomains of interest here, that's really what we're getting at. So I'll give you an example for autonomy. Hey, over the course of 4 hours, I don't want anyone going in there to go change batteries or to right a vehicle that's fallen over or to go and put on a new propeller or to coax the dragonfly to go fly a particular way. The whole point of this is we need to be able to do this with hands-free to the extent that we can push this capability forward. So zero manual interventions, that's what we mean. Zero manual interventions over the course of that long period of time. From a perception perspective, we'd like to be able to resolve objects of interest that are less than 10 centimeters in resolution. So you tell me what kind of information you need, right? But the types of maps that we're interested in can span not only the kind of 3D reconstruction maps that might come to mind immediately, but understanding the situation means things like understanding temperature or chemical concentration gradients, maybe even structural integrity, maybe water or moisture content, understanding if it's available for human breathing, for example. All of those types of things are fair game in terms of how do you represent and perceive that environment and provide the situational awareness. Localization, of course, georectification, certainly a relevant metric. Over the course of a click of traversal, a kilometer of traversal, how do we retain that 10-digit grid, that 1 meter or less level of resolution of interest? From a networking point of view, again, as I highlighted earlier, how do you challenge the assumption that we need to get that real-time feedback all the time, persistently, maintain connectivity all the time? There may be different ways to envision how we can package, share, and distribute information that's relevant to situational awareness. And then ultimately, from a mobility point of view, how do we enable a capability so that in that concept of operation, where we're exploring that space in a rapid time fashion, how do we have that mission endurance last on the order of 4 hours, let's say, in this particular case? That's that window of needing to know what we don't know and learn what we don't know before we send in human operators. So I hope that helps provide some technical envelopes of the areas that we're interested in terms of stretching some of these boundaries. And again, I welcome the interactions with this and the broader community to understand where things are. We have a sense. We'd love to get your inputs, additionally calibrate, and then push well beyond where the state of the art is now. So let me transition a little bit over to the programmatics of this particular broad agency announcement. So in particular, the way we've structured this challenge program is in the form of phases, as you see. I highlighted that we have 2 tracks, a systems track and a virtual track. The systems track is, as the name implies, where we're interested in solutions that have been integrated, built out, field tested, and will be field tested in live experimentation kind of venues. We have a virtual track, which I'll describe a little bit in greater detail shortly, that allows us to not only do the experimentation in the context of virtual and synthetic environments, but also allows us to expand the scope of what we're interested in to scales both temporal and spatial that might not otherwise be afforded in terms of physical experimentation. We structured these in terms of a track A and a track B for the systems competition, and a track C and D for the virtual competition. The way to think about this is for this broad agency announcement, I'm soliciting proposals for Track A and Track C type proposals, solutions. These are DARPA funded against this BAA. You'll, as the contracting officer mentioned, we'll go through that whole evaluation process according to your proposals. And you'll be working through phase 1, 2, and 3 in the context of your proposed work and level of effort. I do want to take the time to highlight that there is this self-funded track that exists also in previous challenges that you might be familiar. But the idea here is, for example, you may want to assemble your own team. You may want to get external sponsorship or internal monies or what have you. But the idea is you might have solutions that happen in your garage or in your lab or international partnerships or whatever. But the idea is just because you're not DARPA funded doesn't mean you can't compete. We're interested in the types of solutions. And so from the folks that are in this room who are contemplating whether or not to propose to the BAA, that's a decision for you. There's no reason you couldn't propose and then opt, if not selected, for example, to compete in the unfunded track as well. And to the extent that both of those will compete, go head to head, ultimately come to the finals event where those innovative solutions, whether they were DARPA investments or self-funded externally, those all come to the table and meet at that final event as shown on the screen. That happens identically for the virtual track, and in the context of what we're looking for here is a phased approach that highlights, again, the scientific and technical merits, the cost realism, the benefit to DARPA and the DoD mission, etc., in the context of this BAA. Okay. You can just ask your question online. Is that a possibility?
Well, specific to that chart, in that chart, it shows the self-funded team that makes it through phase 2, jumping into the funded track.
Yeah.
For phase 3.
Yeah. So there are opportunities. Again, that's outside the scope of the BAA in terms of the mechanisms for doing that. But the idea here is there's an opportunity. Should high performers even in the self-funded track, they have an opportunity to enter in this phase of the competition to receive DARPA funding as well.
But not through this BAA.
But not through this BAA, and thus outside the scope of our proposal. But thank you for the question. It's all relevant. Okay. So let me delve into the circuits a little bit. What I mean, this is the idea behind this, in this context of these circuit challenges. Think of them as almost precursor or mini challenges to an extent. This is where we zero in on the subdomains of the 3 that we've highlighted and conduct basically a challenge event to vet that specific domain. So the first circuit here is the tunnel circuit. The second circuit will be the urban circuit. The third circuit will be the cave circuit. You can think of these as stages of the Tour de France, if you wish. And to the extent that we're interested in highlighting frequent opportunities for your solutions to come to the table, again, according to the BAA, you're coming to the table to compete in all 3 of those of those circuit events. And you want to build, test, and iterate. And if you can kind of glance at the schedule right here, the time between the tunnel circuit to the urban circuit means that that's 6 months. So we want you to be able to develop the capability that takes you from a tunnel environment, 6 months later bring to the urban environment, and then 6 months later get to the cave environment. And that's kind of the structure of these types of circuits. The key takeaway here is that it allows us to expound upon some of the operational needs that focus in those subdomains. But the key takeaway here is that, hey, many of these environments don't exist only in isolation. To give an example, there may be tunnels that abut or otherwise connect to municipal infrastructure. So understanding that seam, as we used that term before, understanding how to maneuver in those seams is critical. This just sets the stage in the circuit context to be able to go and do that. We'll be able to demonstrate in actual sites of interest and also in the virtual context, really broaden that scope in terms of temporal and spatial scales of interest as well. So jumping into the virtual competition a bit, as I highlighted, we can dramatically, to the benefit of the synthetic nature of the virtual environment, we can go and expand what we're really interested in and really study the broader trade space in this environment. So granted, there's a lot to be said for the integrated systems level solution, but there's still a lot of innovation to be had where we can explore some of those things from a software virtual context. And so, as I've highlighted, we have these circuit events. We have a systems track and a virtual track. And we envision for each one of those to have close interaction and feedback between systems and virtual tracks. What do I mean by that? The virtual track allows me to go and calibrate the scenarios that we're interested in exploring for those systems track competitions, those systems track events. We can really use that virtual environment to go and explore that space through the virtual participants and the competitors. Similarly, there's lessons learned from the systems tracks and the circuit events in live experimentation that'll afford us examples and models that we can insert back into the virtual challenge. Right? And now we can have the virtual competitor explore the new technologies that are coming down the pike as developed by the systems track performers as well. So let me give you this analogy. For those of you who are familiar with American football, you can imagine the systems track is your National Football League and all the teams that are associated with it. People bring their teams, they bring their lineups, and who you have on your bench is who you get to play with. The virtual track, think of it more like fantasy football league, where now I have access to all of the teams of the NFL. I get to go and pick and choose my players, my either position players or best athletes, and compose my team in that virtual context so that I can understand the trade spaces and make those decisions, and then articulate and identify the solutions from a software point of view for things like autonomy, navigation, perception, and other things as well. Right? So now I get to compose that team, test it out, and see if there's a capability mix that exceeds what maybe the systems teams are bringing to the table, and we're able to populate that in the virtual competition. This really broadens the kind of sampling of the trade space and the technology capabilities that we're interested in. Okay, and so in terms of what this kind of showcases here is an example of a physics-based simulator that has a rendered cave from actual point cloud data. And here we're just kind of showing you, and again, we'll post this online, a flight vehicle just maneuvering with an envisioned camera, being able to generate sensor data that's fed to whatever algorithm or perception pipeline that you might use to do anything such as semantic mapping or labeling of objects of interest, etc. So we'll use this type of a virtual test bed to go and flesh out many of those things that might be of interest to you, and then go and challenge the types of software-based solutions that one can bring to the table. All right. So this is probably the money slide in terms of what everyone might be interested in. What is DARPA looking for in this context? I think we've hinted at it. Strongly encourage you to go take a look at that draft BAA. There's a lot of good information in there that'll calibrate some of the things that you might be thinking. We're really interested in those revolutionary approaches. We've harped on that, and many of you have expertise working in underground environments. That's wonderful, and that's what we want to bring to the table. On top of that, going well beyond that, I'm interested in how do you use either your experience or lack thereof to envision something that's far out there. How do you bring your what you might have considered a wacky idea, bring that to the table, and we're eager to see how that might provide an innovative solution. We believe that if you come to the table, you'll want to bring your A-team, of course, and that A-team comprises folks that are cross-disciplinary, bring different types of experience or expertise. We do think that in these kind of challenge environments, you're going to need a fair bit of agility, not only from how you do the execution of the work, but in terms of how you think about the problem and pick up yourself when you might be toppled over, literally or figuratively, in terms of your types of solutions. So being able to be responsive yet nimble, I think, is a key aspect of how we've structured this challenge. In your proposals, you'll articulate if you're proposing to a systems track, namely track A, or if you're proposing to a virtual track competition, track C. The phases in here, just to articulate a little bit, phase one basically goes from kickoff, which we anticipate to be around the fall time frame, all the way through tunnel circuit. So you get to cut your teeth on that tunnel circuit, and our government's decision to exercise or not exercise can be done in part by your performance leading up to that tunnel circuit. The second phase comprises both the urban and cave circuit as well. And again, the decision can be made at that point in part to see if you bring something revolutionary to the table. And as hinted at before, that gets condensed into a phase 3 competition that brings you to the final event. So that's how we're looking to structure the proposals. I hinted earlier, FAQs. I'm eager to get your questions. There are a lot of them out there. I can see the thought bubbles over most people's heads right now about those specific questions. Please bring them. We're interested in seeing them here today. I'll answer some, not all, of those questions here this afternoon. But there are a lot of those questions, and that's how we'll tease things out and look forward to kickoff in the fall. And then ultimately, contracting-related questions. We're in a draft BAA phase. We have a little flexibility, as mentioned earlier, to keep these discussions going. So I encourage that type of open lines, again, through these types of forums for exchanging ideas and opening up the aperture. When the BAA does get released, that'll curtail some of the flexibility that we have. So those types of questions, if you might be of interest, you can relay them to our contracting officer as well. Okay. So hopefully, at a glance, that gets to the heart. A lot of the technical details of what to submit, how to submit, what we're looking for is in that BAA document in draft form. We anticipate that to be released in the not too distant future. I hope you take the opportunity to really digest that and dig deep to use the one. And with that, I'll end this segment about the technical aspects, and we're about to take our break. We do have, I encourage you to intermingle, get a sneak peek at some of the posters, if you will. Those of you who are presenting in this next round of lightning talks, I encourage you, in fact, I would like for you to come up and sit in your seats up here in this quadrant right up here, and then we'll power through those here shortly. Thank you again for your interest in the Sub-T Champs. Looking forward to interacting with you today and forward.